The retreat was supposed to be a reset. That was the word used in brochures and phone calls and parent meetings. A reset away from neighborhoods, influences, screens, and noise. In the summer of 2003, deep in the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina, a private youth wilderness program opened its season with 7 children who had been labeled difficult, withdrawn, angry, or simply misunderstood. None of them were criminals. None of them were violent. They were kids whose parents had run out of options and were told that structure, routine, and nature could do what therapy and classrooms could not. The program advertised itself as controlled and disciplined. Every trail was mapped. Every counselor was trained. Radios were issued. Headcounts were logged morning and night. Parents were assured the forest was not wild in the way people imagined. This area, they were told, had been used for decades. Logged, surveyed, walked. Safe. The children arrived in late June, dropped off at a gravel access road that cut through dense tree cover and disappeared uphill. They carried duffel bags packed by parents who lingered too long, offering last-minute instructions and forced optimism. The kids ranged from 11 to 14 years old. Some avoided eye contact. Some tried to look tough. One cried quietly and stopped when a counselor placed a hand on their shoulder and told them this would be good for them. The camp itself sat in a shallow clearing bordered by thick woods on all sides. Canvas tents were arranged in rows. A central fire pit marked the gathering area. Everything looked intentional, ordered, temporary but organized. Counselors walked the kids through rules on the first night. No wandering. No leaving camp without permission. Buddy system at all times. Head counts morning and evening. Radios checked every shift. The first 2 days unfolded exactly as planned. Early wake-ups. Group hikes along narrow trails that wound through pine and hardwood stands. Meals cooked over propane burners. Campfire talks at night about responsibility and trust. The kids were tired in a good way. Muscles sore, voices quieter than when they arrived. Counselors logged compliance. Parents would later be told their children were adjusting well. But by the 3rd day, small things began to feel off. One counselor noticed the handheld radios crackling more than usual. Reception dropped in places it shouldn't have, even close to camp. Batteries drained faster than expected. Another counselor mentioned that one of the trail markers appeared weathered beyond what the program maps suggested. The arrow was there, but the paint was faded, almost old, like it had been nailed to that tree long before the retreat ever existed. During an afternoon hike, the group passed what looked like a collapsed structure just off the trail, not close enough to inspect, but visible through the trees. Old timbers, rusted metal. It wasn't on any of the official maps. When a child asked what it was, a counselor said it was probably an old hunting blind and kept the group moving. That evening, a supply run brought 2 local men up the access road with crates of food and fuel. They chatted briefly with staff, mentioning the heat, the bugs, the way the forest never really gave anything back once it took it. One of them asked how long the kids were staying. When told it was a 2-week program, he nodded slowly and said, almost casually, that the land had a lot of history. Old logging routes, private camps from the 70s, people who built things and never tore them down. There was no warning in his voice, just familiarity. That night, head count was normal. 7 kids accounted for. The counselors zipped the tents, checked radios, and settled into their own sleeping areas. The forest around them was loud with insects and distant animal calls. Normal mountain sounds, nothing alarming. But one counselor lay awake longer than usual, staring at the dark outline of trees and thinking about how far the nearest paved road actually was. Morning came quietly. No shouting. No alarms. Just a counselor walking the tent rows, clipboard in hand, calling names the way he had done every morning before. The first tent was empty. Sleeping bags neatly rolled, like they had been pushed aside. Shoes gone. He assumed the kids were already up, maybe using the latrine or helping with breakfast. The second tent was empty too. Then the third. By the time he reached the seventh tent, his pace had slowed. His voice had dropped. He stood there longer than necessary, staring inside as if the kids might materialize if he waited. The head count came up 0. At first, there was disbelief. Counselors checked the immediate area, behind the tents, near the fire pit, along the path to the latrine. They called names, louder now, voices carrying into the trees. No response came back. The forest seemed to absorb the sound, flattening it. A full sweep of camp followed. Every structure, every trail entrance. The kids' personal items were gone. No bags left behind. No jackets. No notes. There were no overturned objects. No torn canvas. No blood. No signs of a struggle that anyone could point to and say, "This is where it happened." The ground around the tents was packed dirt and leaf litter. In places where footprints should have been obvious, there was nothing. Not even the confusion of overlapping tracks. It was as if 7 children had simply stood up and vanished. Panic didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through questions that had no answers. Who did last head count? Did anyone hear movement during the night? Did anyone see lights? The counselors tried their radios. Static. Broken bursts of sound. One unit wouldn't power on at all. The program director made the call to use the satellite phone, hands shaking enough that he had to try twice to dial. The signal cut in and out as he explained, in fragments, that 7 children were missing. That they had checked everywhere. That they needed help immediately. Local authorities were dispatched, but even that felt distant. The camp was deep in the mountains, accessible by a road that narrowed into gravel and then dirt. While they waited, counselors organized a wider search, pairing up and moving carefully along known trails, calling names, marking time. Every minute that passed made the situation heavier. Kids could get lost. Kids could wander. But 7 of them, together, without waking anyone? As the sun rose higher, the forest revealed itself in uncomfortable detail. Thick undergrowth, steep drop-offs just beyond the cleared paths, places where sound didn't travel, places where someone could stand 10 yards away and not be seen. The earlier confidence in maps and patrols began to feel thin, like something printed to reassure rather than to describe reality. When deputies arrived, they asked the same questions again. Ages, clothing, medical needs, behavioral issues. They walked the camp slowly, noting the lack of disturbance. One knelt by the edge of the clearing, studying the ground, frowning at how clean it was. Another asked about nearby properties, structures, anything not on the official map. No one had good answers. As more vehicles arrived and radios crackled with coordination chatter, a quiet realization settled over the camp. This wasn't a simple missing kid situation anymore. This wasn't a case of someone sneaking off or getting turned around on a trail. Something had happened during the night, something deliberate or deeply strange, and whatever it was had left no obvious trace behind. By late morning, the search perimeter expanded outward into the forest, swallowing the camp in a growing ring of urgency. Parents were notified. Media would follow. The retreat that was supposed to fix 7 young lives had instead become the last place they were ever seen. And as the forest closed in around the search teams, one unsettling thought began to surface, quietly and without proof. If the mountains had taken them, they had done it without a sound. The first responders reached the camp less than 3 hours after the initial call, but by then, the forest had already begun doing what it always did when something went wrong. It closed in. Sound behaved differently beneath the canopy, flattening and scattering. Radio chatter dissolved into static the moment searchers stepped beyond the clearing. Still, the response was immediate and aggressive. County deputies, state park rangers, volunteer search and rescue teams, and local fire crews flooded the access road in waves. Trucks lined the gravel shoulder. Temporary command tents went up near the camp. Maps spread across folding tables, hands tracing contour lines and distances in silence. This was not treated like a routine lost hiker situation. 7 children were missing, all from the same place, all from the same night. That alone shifted the tone from concern to alarm. By mid-morning, the first organized ground teams moved out. They followed known trails first, then widened their paths, cutting perpendicular lines through dense undergrowth. The terrain rose and fell sharply, ridge lines breaking without warning into steep descents thick with brush. Every step off trail slowed progress to a crawl. Still, the search was methodical. Flags marked cleared areas, logs were kept. Every square mile was tracked and rechecked. Search dogs arrived before noon. Experienced handlers, seasoned animals. The children's clothing was used for scent articles, sealed and opened carefully to avoid contamination. The dogs pulled hard at first, noses down, tails stiff. For a brief moment, there was relief, a sense that this would lead somewhere. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Near a disused trail intersection, barely visible, half swallowed by years of growth, the dogs lost the scent completely. Not weakened, not scattered. Gone. The handlers tried again. Different angles, different dogs. Each time, the same result. The trail ended as if the children had simply ceased to exist at that point. Investigators marked the location and expanded the grid. They searched outward in widening circles, expecting to find something. A shoe print, a scrap of fabric, a sign that the kids had panicked and split up. Nothing appeared. The ground offered no answers. The leaf litter was undisturbed. No broken branches, no slide marks down the slopes nearby. Helicopters were brought in that afternoon. Their presence changed the forest's soundscape entirely, rotors chopping through the quiet as they swept low passes over ridges and valleys. Infrared cameras scanned at dusk, looking for heat signatures beneath the trees. Every anomaly was checked. Rocks that held warmth from the sun. Deer bedding down for the night. Nothing human. Nothing moving in a way that suggested children hiding or injured. As night fell, floodlights illuminated the camp and command area. The forest beyond remained black and impenetrable. Search teams rotated in shifts, unwilling to stop. This was the first night, the window when survival odds were still high. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. The idea that 7 children were somewhere out there, cold and afraid, drove the pace harder. Morning came with no breakthroughs. Day 2 brought reinforcements. Additional search and rescue units arrived from neighboring counties. National Guard helicopters were requested. The perimeter grew. Maps were updated with red lines and shaded zones showing cleared ground. The area already covered exceeded what most lost children could travel in days, let alone overnight. And still, nothing surfaced. On the 3rd day, a volunteer found a shoe. It was lying just off a game trail, upright, as if placed there deliberately. It was clean, dry. No scuff marks, no damage from rocks or roots. It belonged to one of the missing children, confirmed by the camp's intake records. The discovery sent a ripple through the search teams. Shoes were common finds in lost person cases, but never like this. Not intact, not alone, not positioned carefully instead of discarded. The area around the shoe was searched intensely. Soil was sifted. Leaves were pulled back. Dogs were brought in again. No scent trail picked up. No matching shoe was ever found nearby. The lone item stood in contrast to the chaos of the operation. a quiet, unsettling anomaly that no one could explain. Officials began holding daily briefings. They spoke carefully. They used phrases like active search and following all leads. Privately, disagreements grew. Some believed the children had followed an unofficial trail and fallen into terrain too difficult to recover from quickly. Others suspected they had been guided, intentionally or not, to a location beyond the immediate search area. The idea of abduction was raised and dismissed repeatedly. There were no signs of forced removal, no tire tracks, no reports of suspicious vehicles. But 7 children vanishing together without evidence didn't fit any familiar profile. It lingered in conversations late at night, spoken quietly and without commitment. By the end of the first week, media presence exploded. News vans crowded the access road. Helicopter footage aired nightly. The story spread beyond the state, framed as a baffling wilderness mystery. Parents arrived and refused to leave. They set up makeshift camps at the forest's edge, watching search teams disappear into the trees each morning and return empty-handed each night. Some parents walked the perimeter themselves, staring into the woods, as if expecting their children to step out at any moment. Others sat in folding chairs, clutching photos, barely speaking. Hope and exhaustion existed side by side, neither one winning. As days turned into weeks, the search expanded beyond logic. The radius grew far past what 7 children, even determined ones, could reasonably reach. Yet the absence of evidence forced investigators to keep pushing outward. The forest offered no bodies, no campsites, no signs of survival attempts, no fire pits, no shelters, nothing to suggest prolonged movement or struggle. Experienced search leaders began to admit what they rarely said out loud. If the children had succumbed to exposure early, remains should have been found. If they had wandered independently, at least one trail should have emerged. If animals were involved, there would be signs. There were none. The forest had not given up a single answer. By the end of the 3rd week, active search operations were reduced. Resources were strained. Leads were non-existent. The language shifted from rescue to recovery, though no one used that word around the families. Maps were folded. Flags were pulled. Some volunteers cried openly as they packed up, unable to reconcile the effort expended with the emptiness left behind. Parents were told the search would continue in other forms: investigations, interviews, analysis. It sounded like progress, but it felt like surrender. As the last search teams moved out and the media attention began to thin, one truth settled heavily over everyone involved. This was not a case of children simply getting lost. Whatever had happened in those mountains had removed them cleanly, quietly, and without leaving behind the kinds of clues that were supposed to exist. And as the forest reclaimed the ground that had been trampled by hundreds of boots, the question that remained was no longer where the children had gone. It was how something like this could happen at all, without the land ever giving them back. By the end of the 3rd month, the search no longer looked like a search. The command tents were gone. The access road was quiet again. What remained were occasional patrols, a few detectives assigned part-time, and a set of case files that grew thicker without getting closer to anything resembling an answer. Official statements framed the decision carefully. Resources had been exhausted. No new leads had emerged. The terrain had been thoroughly covered. Privately, the words used were more blunt. There was nothing left to chase. Within law enforcement, the case fractured into theories that never fully hardened into conclusions. Some investigators believed the children had died early, within the first night or two, and that the forest had simply kept them. Steep ravines, sinkholes, animal activity, and dense undergrowth could conceal remains for years. It was an explanation grounded in probability, even if it failed to account for the total absence of physical evidence. Others quietly rejected that idea. 7 children moving together should have left something behind. A trail. A mistake. A moment where chance intervened. Those investigators leaned toward outside involvement. Not a stranger abduction in the conventional sense, but something less obvious. Someone familiar with the land. Someone who knew where to go and how to move without leaving obvious signs. The problem was that suspicion alone meant nothing without proof. There were no witnesses, no vehicles, no communications, no evidence of planning. In the language of investigations, the case lacked a hook. As weeks turned into months, the retreat organization began to unravel. Enrollment dropped to zero. Insurance costs skyrocketed. Parents pulled out preemptively. The directors released a statement expressing grief and cooperation, then quietly dissolved the program. Within a year, the entity no longer existed on paper. The land lease was terminated. Equipment was sold off. Records were boxed and stored, then misplaced. Several staff members relocated out of state. Some changed careers entirely. One counselor, who had been among the last to conduct headcount the night before the disappearance, declined further interviews altogether. After a brief initial cooperation, he stopped responding to calls, then disappeared from public record. No forwarding address. No employment history that surfaced easily. To investigators, it was unsettling, but not actionable. People leave. People avoid trauma. Avoidance is not evidence. In the nearby towns, rumors filled the vacuum left by facts. Locals spoke of areas in the mountains that didn't appear on maps, old hunting cabins built decades earlier, passed down informally, never registered. Parcels of land that had changed hands quietly or not at all. Stories of people living off-grid long before it became a trend. Some claimed there were compounds deep in the forest, places where no one asked questions and no one wanted visitors. Most of those rumors had circulated for years, long before the children vanished. Now they took on new weight. Deputies followed up on what they could, checking known structures, reviewing land records, hiking out to reported locations. Nothing tied back to the missing children. No signs of recent habitation. No items that could be connected definitively. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny. The parents did not accept the slow fate of the case. They wrote letters. They made calls. They demanded federal involvement, believing that fresh eyes might see what had been missed. Eventually, the FBI reviewed the file. Analysts examined timelines, search reports, and evidence logs. The conclusion was clinical. There was no ransom demand, no indication the children had crossed state lines, no proof of a federal crime. Without jurisdiction, the Bureau could not formally take over. The case remained where it started, labeled as missing persons, with an additional notation added quietly in the margins. Circumstances anomalous. For the families, that phrase became a kind of wound. It acknowledged that something was wrong without explaining anything. Birthdays passed. School years advanced without the children who should have been there. Bedrooms remained untouched. Some parents kept porch lights on every night. Others avoided the forest entirely, unable to reconcile its beauty with what it had taken. As years passed, the land around the former camp changed. Grass grew over tire tracks. Trail markers rotted and fell. Trees reclaimed clearings that had once been full of tents and voices. Hikers passed through without knowing what had happened there. New growth erased signs of disturbance, and with it, the visual memory of the search. Investigators rotated off the case. New deputies skimmed the files and felt the same frustration their predecessors had felt. Every so often, a tip would come in. A sighting, a rumor, a dream reported as memory. Each one was checked, documented, and set aside. Time moved forward for everyone except the families. For them, everything remained anchored to that summer in 2003. They measured life in before and after. They learned to live with uncertainty, though it never settled comfortably. Hope didn't disappear. It thinned. It changed shape. It became quieter. And then, more than a decade later, on land no one had thought to search again, something surfaced that suggested the forest had not been done keeping its secrets after all. The call didn't come through law enforcement channels at first. It came from a private surveying firm contracted to assess a stretch of forest for a proposed conservation easement in the summer of 2014. The parcel sat miles from the original retreat site, separated by ridgelines and valleys that had never been part of the initial search perimeter. On paper, it was unremarkable land, heavily wooded, poor road access, no registered structures, the kind of place that only showed up in county records as a boundary line and a tax assessment. The surveyors had been working the area for several days, marking trees and logging GPS points, when one of them noticed an unnatural depression along a slope. It didn't look like erosion. The angle was wrong. The ground had caved inward instead of washing away. When they moved closer, they saw timber ends protruding through the soil, gray with age, arranged too deliberately to be fallen debris. They cleared away brush and loose dirt by hand. What emerged was the partial collapse of a structure built directly into the hillside. A roof that had once been reinforced with logs and metal sheeting had finally given way, burying most of what lay beneath. From the outside, it would have been invisible, unless someone knew exactly where to look. None of it appeared on their maps. They didn't go inside. The smell was wrong. Old, stale, layered with something they couldn't immediately place. They marked the coordinates, backed away, and made the call that turned a routine survey into something else entirely. Sheriff's deputies arrived first, followed by state investigators, who recognized the location immediately for what it was not. It was not a hunting blind. It was not a storm shelter. It was a living space. Whoever built it had intended to stay for long periods, unseen. The entrance faced away from any natural approach. The structure sat below the tree line, shielded from above. It had been designed to disappear. Inside, the debris was carefully removed. What came into view stopped the room cold. Shelving built from rough-cut wood held rusted cans, their labels faded, but still legible. Dried food remnants lay in sealed containers, stacked deliberately. Improvised bedding lined the back wall, more than one sleeping space, more than one size. And scattered among it all were handwritten notes. They were written in uneven, juvenile handwriting, some on scraps of paper, some on the backs of old forms. The dates ranged from late 2003 into 2005. Short entries at first, lists, names, simple observations. As time went on, the writing changed. The lines grew tighter, the tone more anxious. Mentions of sickness, of waiting, of being told to stay quiet. Forensic teams were called in immediately. The site was secured. The process moved slowly, deliberately. Everything was photographed, bagged, logged. When remains were discovered, there was no confusion about what they were. Small bones, juvenile, not scattered by animals, positioned in ways that suggested placement rather than accident. There were not 7 sets, but there were enough. The confirmation came through DNA and dental records in the weeks that followed. The children had been here, at least some of them. They had not vanished into the forest and died within days. They had survived, not briefly, for months, possibly longer. The news reached the families in carefully structured conversations. Investigators chose their words with precision, but the meaning landed the same way every time. Your child didn't disappear overnight. Your child lived, waited, endured. Grief took on a different shape after that. For some parents, it brought a measure of relief. Proof replaced the endless unknown. For others, it was unbearable. The idea that their children had been alive, somewhere within reach of the world they knew, reopened wounds that had never truly closed. As the investigation expanded, the site revealed more answers and deeper questions. Footwear impressions preserved in the packed earth showed two distinct patterns: smaller prints, consistent with children; larger ones, adult-sized hiking boots. They appeared repeatedly, moving in and out of the shelter area over time. This was not a single visit. It was a routine. The shelter itself showed signs of maintenance. Repairs had been made well after its original construction. New materials introduced. Food restocked intermittently. This was not a desperate attempt at survival by lost children. It was a controlled environment, sustained by someone who knew how to remain hidden and had the means to do so. Investigators traced the structure's origins back decades. Built sometime before the 1970s, likely by someone familiar with logging practices of the era. It sat on land that had passed through multiple hands informally, its ownership blurred by time and neglect. No permits, no records. A blind spot in a system that relied on paperwork to define existence. Recovered clothing fragments matched items listed in the original missing persons reports. A jacket, a shoe that paired with the one found years earlier. The placement suggested they had been removed deliberately, stored, perhaps even saved. The notes hinted at rules, at instructions given, at the presence of someone who decided when it was safe to speak and when it was not. The narrative that emerged was incomplete, but unmistakable. The children had not arrived here by accident. They had been led. Whether through manipulation, coercion, or trust, the result was the same. They had been taken off the grid, held in a place designed to avoid discovery, sustained just enough to persist. When the public learned of the discovery, the reaction was immediate and volatile. Questions poured in. How had this been missed? Why wasn't this land searched? Who else knew about the structure? Officials responded, with timelines and maps, showing how far outside the original perimeter the site had been. It did little to quiet the anger. Behind the scenes, investigators focused on one central question. If someone had kept these children hidden, who was it, and where were they now? The notes offered only fragments, references to a man never fully named, instructions delivered without explanation, promises of safety that rang hollow in hindsight. One entry mentioned being told that the world outside was dangerous, that returning would only make things worse. Another described waiting for permission to leave, permission that never came. The forest around the shelter was searched again, this time with purpose sharpened by certainty. Additional sites were located, smaller, less intact, signs of movement between them, routes that avoided trails, followed natural contours, disappeared into terrain that most people would never choose to cross. Not all remains were found. Some children were still unaccounted for. The possibility that they lay elsewhere, deeper in the mountains, could not be ruled out. The land had already proven it could hide what it wanted to hide. As investigators worked through the evidence, a quiet understanding settled over the case. The disappearance in 2003 had not been an unsolvable mystery. It had been a crime that unfolded slowly, deliberately, in a place where absence went unnoticed and silence was easy to maintain. The discovery answered the question of whether the children survived. It did not answer who made that survival possible or why it was allowed to end the way it did. And somewhere beyond the reach of that collapsed shelter, someone who knew the mountains well had lived their life uninterrupted for more than a decade, carrying a secret that had finally begun to surface. The discovery of the shelter forced investigators to return to records they had once skimmed and dismissed. Old land deeds, utility access maps, seasonal work permits tied to forestry and maintenance contracts in the early 2000s. Names that had appeared briefly, never lingered, and disappeared again. What had once looked like administrative noise now carried weight. One name began to surface repeatedly, not as an owner, but as a presence. A seasonal contractor hired intermittently by state and private landholders to clear trails, repair access roads, and maintain remote facilities. He was known for working alone, known for declining permanent positions, known quietly for preferring to live where records didn't follow him easily. He had been working within a few miles of the retreat in the summer of 2003. On paper, he owned nothing, no property, no registered vehicle for long stretches of time, no utilities in his name. But investigators began to notice patterns, electrical anomalies tied to old lines that shouldn't have been drawing power, water access points altered without permits, witness statements from locals who remembered seeing the same man years apart, always in different places, always alone, always gone before anyone thought to ask questions. He was described as capable, quiet, familiar with the mountains in a way that went beyond recreation. He knew the old routes, the forgotten ones, the places that didn't show up on trail maps or tourist guides. He had been around long enough to understand how the land could hide someone who wanted to stay hidden. The connection remained circumstantial until one of the journal entries recovered from the shelter was examined again. It was a short passage, written unevenly, likely by one of the older children. In it, a name appeared once. No explanation, just a reference. A way to identify someone who didn't want to be identified. That name did not exist in any missing persons database, but it did exist in an old employment file from the late 1980s, an alias the contractor had used decades earlier while working under the table on federal land. It had been flagged once during a background check and then forgotten. The match was enough to justify a warrant. Tracking him was easier than expected. He wasn't hiding in the way people imagine fugitives hide. He was living quietly in rural Tennessee under a different name, working odd jobs, staying in temporary housing, moving every few years. He had no digital footprint to speak of, no social media, no bank accounts that mattered. He existed in the spaces between systems. When authorities arrived, he didn't run. The interview began without theatrics. No raised voices, no immediate denials. He listened carefully, his posture relaxed, his responses measured. When shown copies of the notes, the dates, the photographs of the shelter, he didn't ask how they were found. He didn't claim ignorance. He acknowledged the place immediately. He said he had been protecting them. According to his account, the retreat represented something dangerous, an institution designed to control and damage children under the guise of discipline. He described himself as someone who understood the harm systems could cause, someone who had seen what happened when authority went unchecked. He claimed the children had followed him willingly, that he had offered them safety, food, distance from people who wanted to change them. At first, his narrative sounded rehearsed, but internally consistent. He spoke of routine, of rules meant to keep them alive, of teaching them how to be quiet, how to stay hidden, how to survive without being noticed. He framed the isolation as necessary, the secrecy as protection. But timelines don't bend for belief. Forensic evidence contradicted key parts of his story almost immediately. Food supplies recovered from the shelter showed gaps that aligned with periods when he had left the area for work. Medical evidence suggested untreated illness. Notes written by the children referenced fear, confusion, and punishment for breaking rules. The tone shifted from trust to desperation over time. When Fordy confronted with those inconsistencies, his explanations grew thinner. He admitted to enforcing isolation, to deciding when they could speak, to limiting contact between them. He described control as structure, neglect as necessity. He insisted that everything he did was justified by his conviction that he was saving them from something worse. Investigators didn't argue philosophy. They focused on facts. The children had been removed from their environment without consent. They had been held in hidden locations. They had not been provided adequate care. At least some of them had died under his supervision. Whether through illness, injury, or deprivation, the outcome was the same. The man's calm began to crack when asked about those deaths. He avoided specifics, claimed memory gaps, suggested the forest had taken them, as if distance absolved responsibility. When pressed about the children who were never recovered, he grew silent. His arrest was handled quietly. No press release, no staged walk into a courthouse. Authorities transported him without comment, aware that spectacle would not serve the families or the case. The charges were severe, but the tone remained restrained. Justice, at this point, was procedural, not emotional. For the families, the revelation of a suspect brought conflicting reactions. Relief that someone had finally been identified. Anger that he had lived freely for so long. Confusion at the way he described his actions, cloaked in language that tried to turn harm into intention. They listened to summaries of interviews they would never hear in full. They learned details they hadn't known to ask for. How long their children might have lived. How controlled their world had been. How hope had been rationed by someone else's rules. As the case moved forward, investigators continued searching areas tied to the man's movements. They found more evidence of his off-grid existence, additional shelters, cache sites, places where he had stayed long enough to leave traces and then vanished again. But no definitive answers about the children who remained missing. The man was held without bail. Court proceedings were scheduled. Experts prepared to testify about coercion, trauma, and the psychology of control. It looked, finally, like the story would reach a public reckoning. But even as the system moved toward resolution, one question remained unresolved: whether the truth that had emerged would ever feel complete to the people who had waited more than a decade for answers, because knowing who took the children did not fully explain what they endured, or how much of their story would remain buried in the mountains, beyond the reach of records, testimony, or punishment. Court records did what the forest never had. They forced the story into sequence. Dates, movements, decisions written down without emotion. When the filings became public, the outline of what happened in the mountains finally stopped shifting. It didn't soften anything. It clarified it. The children were not taken in a rush. There was no moment of panic, no masked figure tearing through tents. Investigators concluded that the first contact happened quietly, during a window of confusion, when routines were new and authority felt unfamiliar. The man approached them as someone who belonged there. He knew the camp schedule. He knew when supervision thinned. He spoke calmly. He offered certainty when the environment felt uncertain. He didn't threaten them. He persuaded them. Court psychologists described it as coercion built on timing and trust. The children were told the retreat wasn't what it claimed to be, that it would get worse, that adults would punish them for mistakes they didn't yet understand. He offered an alternative, a place away from rules that felt arbitrary, a place where they could decide things together, where no one would yell, where they would be safe. They followed him because he sounded like someone who knew what he was doing. The records show that the first shelter was reached within hours. That initial night, the children were fed. They were reassured. Notes written later describe relief, a sense that the worst had been avoided. That feeling didn't last. As weeks turned into months, the reality narrowed. The shelter became the entire world. Rules multiplied. Silence became enforced. Movement was controlled. The man decided when they could speak and when they couldn't. He decided when they could leave the shelter and when they had to stay hidden. The forest that had once felt like protection became a boundary they weren't allowed to cross. Survival lasted longer than anyone had expected. That was the part investigators struggled with most. The children adapted. They rationed food. They followed instructions. They took care of one another in small ways, recorded in the margins of the notes they left behind. They believed, at least at first, that compliance would lead to freedom. It didn't. Medical examiners testified that illness likely began months in. Minor injuries went untreated. Infections lingered. Nutrition declined as food deliveries became less frequent. The man's work took him away for longer stretches. The structure that had once been maintained began to decay. The children waited. One by one, their bodies failed in ways that could have been prevented. The records never used the word abandonment, but the pattern was unmistakable. As conditions worsened, care diminished. The man did not seek help. He did not bring them back. He stayed committed to the belief that isolation was still safer than the world he feared. Not all of the deaths could be timed precisely. Some were inferred through changes in handwriting, gaps in entries, shifts in language. The children wrote less as time went on. When one stopped being mentioned, the silence spoke for itself. Recovery teams confirmed that not all remains were found. 2 children were never recovered, despite expanded searches guided by the man's movements and partial statements. Investigators believe they were buried deeper in terrain that has since become inaccessible, either through collapse or overgrowth. The forest had reclaimed those places completely. Families were informed carefully. Again. This time, there was nothing new to discover, only confirmation that some questions would remain unanswered forever. The man never stood trial. He died in custody before sentencing, from natural causes complicated by age and health. The announcement was brief. No statement. No ceremony. For the families, it felt like another door closing, not because they wanted to hear him speak, but because his silence was now permanent. Whatever details he hadn't shared were gone with him, the exact locations, the moments when choices could have been different, the thoughts he never recorded. All of it ended without resolution. The case was officially closed shortly afterward. Investigators held a final briefing. The language was precise. Charges were noted. Findings summarized. The words closure and justice were avoided. No one in the room believed them. Parents were left with something they had once begged for and now struggled to carry. Answers. Not enough to heal, but enough to make the loss concrete. Their children had not vanished into nothing. They had lived. They had waited. They had hoped that the man who controlled their world would eventually let them go. That knowledge changed everything. Some parents returned to the mountains in the years that followed, not to search, but to stand at a distance. Others refused to ever see the place again. There was no right way to respond to a truth that arrived so late. The land itself remained unchanged. Trails were still hiked. Camps still operated in nearby areas. New children laughed where others once disappeared. The forest didn't mark the places where suffering had occurred. There were no signs, no warnings, no boundaries to tell anyone what had happened there. Time moved forward, indifferent to the weight it carried. 11 years had passed before the truth surfaced, and even then it emerged incomplete. Not because investigators failed, but because the mountains had done what they always did. They held on to what they were given and released it only when the conditions were right. The children's story didn't end with discovery. It ended with understanding, and the realization that disappearance doesn't always mean death. Sometimes it means being hidden. Sometimes it means surviving long enough for hope to become part of the tragedy. And somewhere between the trees, in places that will never be marked on a map, the silence still holds what wasn't found. Not erased, just delayed.